My name is Fida Jiryis. I'm a Palestinian writer. I also work in translation and in editing, primarily in English. One of the things I noticed about this book is the fact that it said that it includes Palestinian writers from Israel, from the territories, from Ramallah, from Gaza, and from the diaspora. Perhaps I represent all of them because my experience has been in living in all of these three places in a very curious life story, which I would not have imagined turned out the way it did. A few words about my father, who's here with us today. His name is Fida Jiryis. My father was 10 years old at the time of the Nakba, and he saw people from villages near Fasuta leaving for Lebanon. He grew up in Israel, and he graduated from the Hebrew University. And he worked for about 5 years as a lawyer with Hanna Nakara, who was a Palestinian lawyer who worked in Haifa at the time. My father was also one of the founders of Al-Ard movement. And after a series of troubles and detentions and expulsions and so on with the authorities, and an unsuccessful attempt to run for the Knesset elections in 1965, he found himself in 1970 in a situation of voluntary expulsion. I was born in Lebanon, where he traveled with my mother. I was born, and my brother was born in Lebanon, and we grew up there. We were there during the Israeli invasion of 1982. We were young children at the time. In 1983, during this time, my father, of course, worked as the director of the research center of the PLO, and he was a close associate of Yasser Arafat. He was his advisor on Israeli affairs. We witnessed, as I said, the Israeli invasion. So as a small child, my memories are extremely traumatic of that period. As it so happens, it's interesting that this is taking place tonight, this event, because I'm actually just now writing a book of my memoirs about my family's history and our story, and I'm writing the story of Palestine through our personal story. My memories of the Israeli invasion are very vivid and very traumatic. I think we remember very violent things quite vividly, even though it has been a long number of years since then. In 1983, in February, the research center where my father and mother worked was targeted through a huge explosion that was set up. That was Samain? That was set up by the Christian Phalangist movement at the time. Of course, it was done in close collaboration with Israel. During that explosion, several employees of the center lost their lives, and one of them was my mother. This was in 1983. I was 9 years old, and my brother was 5. Following this, we ended up in Cyprus. The research center was reopened there, although on a smaller scale. We continued. We grew up. The rest of our growing up years were in Cyprus until something totally unexpected, at least as far as we were concerned, as young adults, happened, and the Oslo Accords were signed. I was just in the last year of university in England at the time, and suddenly, overnight, my dad said that we could come back to our village, to Fasuta, which is in the Upper Galilee, near the Lebanese border, actually, ironically. In Christmas of 94, I found myself back here for the first time. I cannot even begin to describe the feelings of a Palestinian who has grown up all their life, as a Palestinian, particularly with our story, with my father's story, with our history, very traumatic, very painful history. Of suddenly finding themselves in the place that they never ever thought they would come back to. We were, of course, part of a very small number of people, they could probably be counted on one hand, who managed to come back to their villages inside Israel after the Oslo Accords. Thus began a new chapter of my life, and one that I think the best way I can term it is to say social schizophrenia. That's what I felt. Suddenly, overnight, I became an Israeli citizen. Suddenly, overnight, I had to go to work in Israeli companies, and I actually had to meet Israelis for the first time. Those people who, to me, were the same people who had, carried out the invasion in Lebanon and who I had suffered the biggest losses of my life because of. So you can imagine how traumatic, how unsettling this was for me to come back here. I also had to learn Hebrew. I taught myself Hebrew through the Stimatsky. It was a book and it was cassette tapes at the time. I sat at home and tried to master the language. Of course, I had to overcome a very huge emotional and psychological barrier to try to do this. But I was successful in putting my emotions aside and doing this because I quickly understood that I needed the language to survive and to function on a day-to-day basis. I carried on. I worked in Israel for 8 years, and after that, I took a decision to leave the country completely and to go to Canada. I couldn't integrate. I couldn't function. I couldn't really find my place in either of the two societies, even among my own Palestinian society. Even in Fasuta, I couldn't really find anybody that would relate to my story, that had any idea of where I had come from and what kind of values I held, what kind of history, and so on. Among Israeli society, sadly, at the time, I also did not manage to meet any friends or any like-minded people. I worked in the field of high-tech. I worked in Sefin, which is an industrial zone in the north. And after that, I worked in Carmiel during the time of the Second Intifada. That was a particularly traumatic experience where I had colleagues that I would see in the kitchen and I would greet in the morning or when I went to make coffee, and they simply would not answer. During the time of the Second Intifada itself, I had jeers and a lot of things were said to me from colleagues and I couldn't answer. So بلشون كروتا really resonates with me very much because I felt I was in a position where I couldn't really say anything. 2 or 3 times when I did attempt to answer, things got very tense, and I was also afraid because I understood what it meant at the time, in the conditions at the time, to express yourself as a Palestinian. I think that was the straw that broke the camel's back, and I decided, I applied for immigration and I went to Canada. I thought, I'm leaving this country. I don't want to come back. I can't deal with this. This was way beyond anything I had ever expected to deal with. But the thing is, as soon as I arrived in Canada, I was plagued by a constant sense of homesickness. And my friends over there, they would laugh about it. They would say, you just spent all these years and you went back and forth to the Canadian embassy 20 times to get your visa and to leave. And here you are and you want to go back now. And I said, I really, really am homesick. And at roughly the same time, 6 years later, in 2009, my stepmom was very sick at the time and needed me to come home, which I did. And by chance, I had gone to visit some of my friends in Ramallah. And one of them said, why don't you come back and try to find a job here? Your English is good. You could probably find a reasonable job here and you would be in the country, but you would not have to deal with the Israeli system as such. So if in a sense, it was a kind of running away, if you like. But also in another sense, being in Ramallah gave me something very, very special. It was maybe an imagined sovereignty, if you like. A place, where I had the sense that at least I could speak in Arabic freely, that I was free from this constant sense of heaviness and hassle and 10th class citizen feeling that I had in Israel. I've been in Ramallah now for 10 years, but again, nothing prepared me for what I would see in Ramallah, which is the other side of the same coin, the occupation. A lot of people have asked me, why would you voluntarily go and live under occupation? And usually my answer is because for me, I feel the same occupation, sadly, on both sides. It doesn't matter on which side of the green line I am, the occupation is there. In one sense, it's physical. In the other, it's psychological. 2 years ago was the beginning of what I call a transformation for me, a little bit of a transformation. For the first time, I would meet Israelis who are working towards peace. And primarily, they were from Shovrim Shtika. They asked me to take part in a book with them, a collection of essays that were written by some local and some international writers. I was the only one who wrote about 1948 and about coming back here as a Palestinian from abroad and effectively, if you like, realizing the right of return. and what that meant for me, what I saw in Israel, what I experienced as an Arab citizen of the state. The book really took off. It hit the Washington Post bestseller list. We went to the States and to Europe, and particularly in the States was also my first exposure to Jewish audiences. We sat in San Francisco in two halls that were packed full of Jewish Americans who had come out to hear us. And for me, it was very powerful, both in terms of the group, the Shovrim Shtika group that I was working with, as well as these audiences. It was really my first experience ever of reaching out to Israelis or to Jews. And being able to be so frank about the situation and having my voice heard. When I was asked to take part in this book, it seemed to be another step in that path. And I would really like to thank each and every person who has worked on this book for giving me this chance, because truly, I never even imagined that I would come back to Israel, never mind that I would actually have any of my works translated to Hebrew. After a long journey, I have understood the importance of having Arabic and Palestinian work translated to Hebrew, because I've understood the necessity, the absolute necessity of dialogue, and that as painful and difficult and disconcerting and complicated and tense it is actually the only way forward to try and find some path out of this insanity. I say this while taking into full account the very, very different opinions of many Palestinian writers. When I speak today, of course, I represent myself on this. I know that it's a very controversial issue. Many people would agree with me. Many others talk about, muqata, and they don't want, and so on. For me, personally, I think it is extremely important for Palestinian works to be translated into Hebrew and to be read by Jewish and by Israeli audiences, because I think really it is time for this overwhelming silence that I felt all the time when I was in Israel to be broken. And it is really time for us to be able to engage in really open dialogues, and not just the coffee and biscuit evenings, as I call them, where people go and have coffee with each other and feel they've done their civic duty and they go home. So again, thank you very much to Van Leer for organizing this. Thank you very much to all the readers of this book, to all the team that has worked on this book. I'm proud and honored to be here today. And on behalf of all the writers whose voices are represented in the book, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you.